Welcome to the Journey Home, and welcome back after the holidays. I pray that you had a blessed Christmas and a happy New Year. I feel great to be back live on the television. It's also good to be down here in this warm weather in Alabama. I need to pray for my family who are up in Ohio in the midst of a winter storm, but I'll enjoy the warmth while I'm here. My guest this week on Journey Home is Dr. William Park. And as with so many of my guests, there are so many themes which we can focus on. He'll talk later about the influence of Newman on his journey and a place of Mary in his conversion. But what impressed me most about Dr. Park's journey was as a professor of English at Sarah Lawrence University, a secular university, in the midst of that, he found Christ and his church. And it's a good point for us to remember today when many of us parents worry about our children going to universities that Christ can be found there. And we'll talk a bit about that. And I want to remind you that your phone calls and emails, questions are an essential part of this program. We actually do the first part of the program, we kind of condense everything to save time for you to ask your questions, to hear what thoughts you have, what questions you have about the journey of our guest. So if you want to call, it's 1-800-221-9460. If you'd like to email us, it's journeyhome@EWTN.com. Dr. Park, welcome to the Journey Home.
Thank you.
Now, how long have you taught English?
37 years at Sarah Lawrence, and
right?
8 years before that at Columbia and Hamilton College also.
So, was it American English or literature?
18th century English has been my specialty.
All right.
And I also teach film history.
Film history?
Yeah.
We'll talk about that later, because that's a fascinating part of your own journey.
Yeah.
In fact, you've written an article on the 50 best Catholic films?
That's right, in Crisis magazine.
We'll talk about them a little bit.
Right.
Let's begin, though, with so much to cover. Let the audience hear about your early part of your own spiritual journey.
Well, I was raised as a Presbyterian. On my mother's side of the family, I came from a long line of Presbyterian ministers. One was a chaplain in the Continental Congress. Another one wrote, Stand Up for Jesus."
Is that right?
But my parents didn't belong to the church, but they always sent me. And then in school, we had compulsory chapel, and at Princeton, where I went to college, there was also compulsory chapel. Mm-hmm. So I considered myself a Presbyterian. But when I left college, I felt that I didn't need church or any structure. And I tried to be an atheist, but I couldn't, it was too fanatic for me. But I tried to, a do-it-yourself religion, or Christianity. An example would be on a trip once in Greece, when my family, we were visiting the Oracle of Delphi, and the Castalian spring comes down from the Mount Olympus. And it was so beautiful, and the Greeks used to bathe, purify themselves in that spring. So I thought that this would be a great time to baptize my youngest son, but in a kind of a do-it-yourself way. And that's the condition I was in.
Certainly not in the name of the Father and Son and Holy Spirit, I imagine.
But I did do that.
Oh, did you really?
Yes.
Oh,
but
okay.
So I was sort of trying to fuse my humanism with my do-it-yourself Christianity. So, but in my 40s, my life started to come apart, at least internally. I had all kinds of difficulties, troubles with my children, and one night I was sitting by myself and I just broke down, and I realized that I needed Christ and I needed structure. So I went to, we didn't have a Presbyterian church in Bronxville, but there's a Reformed church there. So I went there, sought out a minister, a wonderful minister named Ted Fritsch, who's now retired. And he was very helpful, and he gave me a book by Simone Weil called Waiting for God. And I was so taken by that, especially her essay on affliction and implicit forms of the love of God, that I decided I would change my teaching. I would stop teaching film and devote more time to religious literature. So I started teaching the Bible. I taught a course in Simone Weil. And I decided I'd teach spiritual autobiography as well. And to show how liberal I was, I thought I would try a Catholic one. So I read Newman's Apologia Pro Vita Sua.
Oops.
And it completely destroyed my Protestant beliefs. It completely undercut them. But Simone Weil had said that you should never, God had placed you in a religion and you shouldn't change. You should stay in the religion you were born into. She didn't do that, by the way, but that's what she
told everybody else to do.
So I stayed in the Reformed Church for 7 years. I taught Sunday school, and I decided that Providence had put me there and I should stay there.
We're going to talk a little later about what the part Mary played in your own journey, and again, Newman. You mentioned Newman.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking back in those days, where was Mary at? Did she have any place in your theology, or even a place of Catholic literature like Newman?
No. And of course, even though I was a doctor in English literature, no one in my whole career had ever asked me to read one word of John Henry Newman as a PhD in English literature.
I'm not sure the audience would appreciate how absurd that is, but I mean, he's one of the greatest of English writers.
Right.
In fact, the Apologia Pro Vita Sua is considered a major classic
of
English literature.
Yeah, but it's not required anywhere.
And it touches on something which we'll hope to touch later, and that is the fact that so many non-Catholics have never read books about the Catholic Church written by Catholics.
That's right.
And so there's a certain ignorance there. What is it that grabbed your heart?
Well, one of my sons, who was on the West Coast, was in terrible difficulty. He was breaking up with his girlfriend. He had all kinds of troubles. And I wanted to go out and help him, but he was very angry with me at the time and told me in no uncertain terms, do not come, stay away, I don't want to see you. And I was filled with such despair, I did not know what to do. And I was walking by a Catholic church, St. Joseph's, and I went in and I knelt down before the statue of Our Lady and thinking of her son and what troubles that she went through, and I prayed to her. And I don't know whether I was there in hours, I lost complete track of time, but I just asked her for help and to please help my son. That was on a Saturday. The next morning, Sunday, of course I wasn't going to church, I was reading the New York Times, my religion, and the phone rang. And it was my son's girlfriend. And she said, Bill, I'm going to have a baby. I'm going to have Jeffrey's baby. And I don't care what happens, I'm going to have this baby. And I took that as a direct answer to my prayer, that baby was the answer for everything. And I felt that my prayer had been answered. And you could look upon that as a coincidence, but I knew, and as it turned out, my son and his girlfriend were very soon married. The baby was born. She's now a wonderful teenager and has a young sister, and they're doing very well, and they're a wonderful, happy family. And I know that Our Lady is protecting them in a very special way.
I was going to say, kneeling before a statue of Mary isn't a typical Presbyterian thing to do.
No. But at that point, I had, as they say, crossed the Rubicon. I knew I could not go back. I mean, after that phone call, I knew I could not go back to the Reformed Church. So then I met, as a matter of fact, the associate pastor of my parish church, the Catholic Church, is Father George Rutler.
The audience may know Father Rutler, who himself is a convert to the church.
And someone at Sarah Lawrence had told me that there's this priest at St. Joseph who was also very influenced by Newman. You should talk to him. So that same day, I was walking by the train station. There was a priest, and I asked him if he was Father Rutler. And he said, yes, come with me to the rectory. So, and he gave me Father Hardin's Catechism at that time to read, and said he was going to Rome and he'd see me in a month. And I read it overnight, and
That's not a quick book to do overnight.
No, I read it as though it was a thriller. It was a thriller. And when he came back, I wanted to get into the, I said I wanted to get into the church. But there was one problem because according to Father Hardin, I was still married to my first. I'd been married once before, and my wife and I had been married for 25 years.
Your present wife.
According to the Catechism, in the eyes of the Church, I was still married to my first wife, who, because we were both baptized Protestants, married by a Protestant minister. So Father Rutler sort of thought there wasn't any problem, but when he talked to the Monsignor, they thought I should go to the tribunal, and I applied to get an annulment, and that came through, and then I could come into the church.
It's amazing. That's quite a jump from an answered prayer in front of a statue of Mary, which again is not, like you said, not a very Presbyterian thing to do,
right.
And then a reading of the Catechism. In the midst of that, of course, is the work of the Holy Spirit. I'm wondering, when you read that Catechism, can you remember as you were reading it, any things that were problems or things that jumped out at you or just made sense? Because it's a wonderful Catechism, that particular book.
Well, one thing that I never understood as a Protestant, I always laughed at Catholics because the Bible clearly says that Jesus had brothers and sisters. So that and it's so simple that I think it was reading them that I realized that when Jesus was on the cross and he gave his mother to John, if he had a lot of brothers and sisters, he wouldn't have had to do that. So the Bible itself is saying that the brothers and sisters are kinsmen. Mm-hmm. And it's so clear, and it was like a flash of light because that had been an obstacle for me that I then understood it.
Did your conversion then to the church affect your work as a professor?
I was able to work much better. A book I'd been floundering around in for years, I was able to finish very quickly. I've doubled my writing productivity. I'm not tied in a knot anymore.
Oh, the grace of God. Did your wife come in with you?
No, not immediately. My wife was raised as a Christian Scientist, and in college she lost her faith. She became an art historian. We met at Columbia University when we were both graduate students, but her field was medieval, so that she was working on crosses. Her dissertation was on a Spanish ivory crucifix. But
it makes me funny the way the Lord works in our lives,
But she did not want to have anything to do with this journey. I mean, she didn't mind it, but she wanted to keep her distance. So after I came into the church, Father Rutler sent me to a priest, Father Bob Bucciarelli. He said, "Do not proselytize your wife," which is very hard for husbands, I think, to keep quiet. So I tried not to. And after the annulment came through, my wife she said, "May I come to church with you?" And we went into church and she knelt and crossed herself. And before long, she said that she wanted to be a Catholic too. And I know that annulment was a major factor in that, because people laughed at me and they said, "Well, you can't go to the church because you have to wait. This is ridiculous. Our church wouldn't, this wouldn't be a problem at all. You've been happily married for 25 years. You have children. This is ridiculous." But I understood, and Newman was helpful in this too, that the church is objective as well as subjective. There's a law, and that it isn't just a private matter. So that the legalism was spiritual. And it brought me and my wife closer together. And 2 years after I came into the church, she was received into the church by Father Rutler, interestingly enough, at the Église de Notre Dame, which is a church on near the Columbia campus, a block from where we met in the first place. So,
what is there about what Newman said when you read Apologia Provida Sua? What is there about that really got your attention that first reading?
Well, the first thing was his distinction between private judgment, what he called the principle of private judgment, and the dogmatic principle. Now, dogma is a dirty word. I mean, people think that dogma is horrible, but when I read Newman, I realized that dogma is something very beautiful. The creation, that God created the world, is a dogma. That Jesus Christ is his son is a dogma. And I realized that without dogmas, we just would slide into complete subjectivity and sophistry, that there is no reality, everything is opinion. And Newman believed that if God loved us, he would want us to know that there was truth. There is such a thing as truth. That whole book is about truth. And if God loved us, he would reveal the truth to us. And I came to realize that if you started with dogma, that is mystery, you could be reasonable. But if you start with reason, you become mysterious. In other words, you can't think anymore. There's no objectivity.
Yeah. It reminds me, I'm getting a picture in my mind of my boys have a little board that has nails in it that they can put rubber bands between the nails, and when they're done, they can have a star or a picture. And those nails are very important, because if there weren't any nails there, you wouldn't be able to create anything beautiful, but the nails allow for the truth.
Right.
You know, that picture. If the nails were random, you'd get a mess. And that's what happens today when everything's kind of random, there's nothing.
That's right, and it has no meaning. Everything's trivial pursuit.
Now we make sure that the audience knows that we're talking about John Henry Cardinal Newman, who was an Anglican minister 150 or so years ago, converted, and as a result of his conversion, he eventually became a cardinal and brought many people in his wake into the church.
Right.
Being with his great writing, do you recommend to our audience his books?
Well, I think that Apologia is one of the greatest spiritual autobiographies, and you learn more about Christianity. And the chapter on what he calls the position of my mind since 1845 is the clearest exposition of what I would call Protestant difficulties with the Catholic Church. It's a very, very wonderful book.
It's a great book because he didn't intend to write it.
No.
Is that right? I mean,
No.
he
was attacked by Kingsley. I think he had it in the back of his mind to write it.
But this was pushed in a corner, and he finally used it as an excuse to do. Mary is often a very difficult hurdle for people considering the Catholic Church. In your case, it was like Mary right off the bat, wasn't it? Did Newman help you in your understanding of Mary?
Right. He has two wonderful sermons on Mary, and it was very helpful. And to realize her role, and this, of course, is important, the role of intercession. And of course, that is in the Bible. I mean, for Mary is intercedes of the first miracle. And he explains that very well, and how it is appropriate to pray to Mary, not to pray to Mary to intercede, or to ask Mary to intercede, as well as the other saints.
Just had about an hour-long argument this week with someone on the phone who had left the Catholic Church over the issues of Mary. Right. And their idea was they just couldn't agree with the Catholic Church elevating Mary to equality with Jesus. Right. We obviously don't teach that.
Right.
How can they even hear us say that?
I mean, it's just a false view. It's like, it's a smear. I mean, it isn't. It just isn't true.
I think it also gets back to maybe what you were saying earlier about your whole life you had never read a book by a Catholic, and many people don't take the time to really examine what the Church teaches about Mary.
And another thing about Newman was his teaching about the visible church. I'd never even heard that phrase before, but that Jesus came to earth and to establish a church to help us on the road to salvation. And I mean, it's very hard for Protestants to realize that the church is part of the system of salvation. I mean, as a mystical body of Christ, and what was meant by apostolic. He helped me greatly with that. One of my students came to me and said that her church had just rewritten the Apostles' Creed, and she said that without any irony, and Newman explains how the tradition is alive, what he called, the doctrine of developments. That is that the Catholic Church is the primitive church, but it has developed the deposit of faith in history, and so it's a vital, growing thing, and our dogmas are defined, but that is appropriate.
Let's talk a bit about, go away from Newman for a little bit, we may come back to him later. It still is amazing to me when I hear of a professor in English at a secular university in the midst of all the voices and pressures that there are there, the tenure pressures, all of that, in the midst of that, to find Christ. And my guess is that there are some even in our audience whose children have gone away to a secular university only to find that in the process they've lost their faith. Talk about the structure, the stresses there in that environment.
Well, it's sort of, I mean, to be a Catholic is sort of low, you know. I mean, you're not. It's not Catholicism on the whole in liberal colleges is not highly regarded. But my college, my colleagues are truly liberal, and they tolerate me, and they allow me to teach, and
that's liberal not in the political sense.
No, I mean that they're in the John Stuart Mill sense, that they're genuinely liberal and have been very good to me. But the thing with English literature, the great works are Christian. So that when you're teaching the great classics, whether they're Protestant or with Shakespeare, Milton, Chaucer, and so on, they are Christian works. Dickens. These are Christian authors, so that helps a lot. Then with all the mode of deconstruction, you realize that the people who are deconstructing literature.
Explain deconstruction.
Well, it's that every text is flawed. I mean, there are no authors. There are only strong readings of texts. It's very much based on the philosophy of Nietzsche. That's an act of will. So that you deny the author, the text is riddled with anomalies, and so you do a deep reading of the text, and in a way you're asserting yourself as a power.
This is the kind of rampant idea.
But when you realize, though, that what deconstruction made me realize that even reading is an act of faith, because I mean they're very rigorous in their thought, but again, like. Their thought just leads to skepticism. There's no reality, and to relativism. And when I saw that criticism was going that way, and it didn't really make any sense to me, then that made Newman all the more powerful in what he was saying.
Again, a work of grace.
Yeah.
That Jesus makes that statement about how difficult it is for a rich man to get into the kingdom. Right. There's a sense in which you can almost say the same thing is difficult for an intellectual.
Well, you're right, because we're a proud lot. We take great pride in our intellect.
And it takes the gift of grace to break through that.
Right.
And any advice for parents that struggle with sending kids off, letting them go to university?
Well, they should major in English or science. But I think the pendulum's going to swing back the other way.
Yeah.
And I think that many people are taking, especially with like the new encyclical, the Pope, they're taking the church and its theology and much more seriously. I'm encouraged.
When I listened to your journey, and of course I read it in more full earlier when you gave me a copy of it, I was struck by the work of Providence in your life. I mean, I hope that as the guests are on the program, that as we share our journeys, that we're not looking like we're patting ourselves on the back for finding Jesus ourselves or finding the church. It's a work of God, work of grace. And I listened to your own story, and I was thinking about the dropping of Newman into your life at that moment, the visiting of that church, and there's the Mary statue, and even the freedom for you to feel open to praying. And then Father Rutler's walking at a train station,
I know.
And the phone call comes, and I mean the work of Providence in your life.
I know it's remarkable that, and it continues. That the man, an older lawyer, took me to one of my first evenings of recollection in the church, and then he became a priest, and he gave instruction to my grandson, who just took his first communion. Yeah. And it's just so it's wonderful. But I mean, when you teach the Bible, or when you teach Genesis, that great moment when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers and says, you know, be not afraid, God did send me before you to preserve life. So the evil the brothers did is what saved them. And that's the meaning of Genesis, but it's the meaning of the Bible, that the fall of man is what has saved us because it brought us Christ. And it just, it's overwhelming. There's I want to say put a plug in for what I think is one of the greatest of all novels, which is Tom Jones, which is a comic novel. But the title is The History of Tom Jones, and the real theme of the work is Providence, because feeling makes you think that everything in the book is accident. It's all governed by fortune. And actually all the fortune comes together to redeem Tom at the end. And it's a wonderful work.
Well, it kind of brings me into another part of your avocation, which is film.
Right.
I mean, you've taught the history of film, and I mentioned that you wrote the article on what the 50...
My version, right. The 50 best Catholic films.
And you had
the Vatican and I only agreed on 15.
Oh, really? Well, name a couple of the films that that really stand out for you.
Well, It's a Wonderful Life, I think. Certainly, I think almost any film by Capra or Ford.
Which they had kind of an interesting place in your journey, didn't they, too?
Right, right. I realized that Capra, Ford, and Hitchcock, whom I've been teaching before I converted, only after I converted did I realize that all three of them were practicing Catholics. They weren't just raised as Catholics, but they're practicing Catholics. I think Quiz Show is a wonderful movie.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, powerful movie.
I like that very much.
Because sometimes movies are subtle in what they're trying to communicate in their religious themes, but there's virtues.
And there's a great Japanese film called Ikiru, which means to live, and it's about an older man who also discovers the meaning of life. Those are very great films.
Well, maybe our audience might have a question on how we as parents help our children pick good films. Well, let's take a break now. We'll come back in just a moment to take your questions and emails for Dr. Park, and also on some of the questions he brought up, maybe about Newman or Mary, and maybe this issue of films. Be back in a moment. Welcome back to the Journey Home. My guest, Dr. William Park, has been talking about his own journey as a professor of English at Sarah Lawrence University, Sarah Lawrence College, and has talked about the impact of Newman's writings, and again encourages us to consider reading, especially his Apologia Pro Vita Sua, in the place of Mary in your own journey. And of course, I could also say the place of Father Hardin's Catechism.
Right.
I mean, there again, reading what the Catholic Church teaches by a Catholic. And it's a great catechism.
Right.
In fact, for you at that point, it was almost like a thriller you mentioned. Let's start out by taking some of your questions. Let's begin with this first email, if we would. Dear Marcus and guests, thank you for sharing your journey, Dr. Park. How would you and Marcus, and quote, and Cardinal Newman, we'll do the best we can for answering for Cardinal Newman, explain indulgences, a topic which is currently being brought to the fore by the upcoming Jubilee 2000, and gratefully, Doubting Thomas in New York.
Well, the problem with indulgences was the selling of indulgences, as I understand it. In other words, there was a corrupt practice in the Church of selling them and using them for profit. But as Jesus has said, what you loose on earth, I will loose on heaven. That's the basis for indulgences. So if the Church relieves us of our sin and of our time in purgatory, they have biblical authority to do that. That's what indulgences are. And the problem in the Reformation period was the sale of them, and it was very corrupt.
And and maybe the false implication was also coming with the sale, and that is, I think that was when the penny drops in the bucket, someone's released from purgatory.
So that you didn't have to be truly penitent.
Yeah, because indulgence gains its meaning on what's going on in our heart.
Right.
The intent of our heart, just as confession does.
Right.
If we go into a confession, say everything we did, especially with the intent of I'm going to do it again tomorrow, well, then that confession didn't do any good.
Right.
Okay, it's the content of our heart.
Right.
Confession begins here, inside. Let's try this this other question, email question, if you would. It says, hello from San Antonio, Texas, and from Cullis. I have a question for your guest, Marcus. Why are so many Christians doing do-it-yourself Christianity in all the non-denominational churches? What's happening? Love your show. In other words, why are they out there just doing it themselves? They're all in non-denominational churches.
Well, part of it is our history as a Protestant country. Part of it is the Enlightenment, the Enlightenment project, you might say, which teaches us that the church is merely a political institution. I mean, it's like a bank. It has, and so that our tradition is to be cynical about religious institutions. And I think this is why people are afraid of the church, because they think institutions are corrupt. We're going through a crisis where we think our government is corrupt. So, and people are looking for spirit, and they don't realize that the church is an institution that is spiritual, that the two go together. So they separate them. I think that's the problem.
I might throw in just another thought too with that, and I think back to my own background. When there were times when as a pastor I was doing my own thing, and it's difficult when you are trying to follow Christ in the way that you understand given your particular denominational tradition. When you live in a community when there's 30 other traditions, all that love the scriptures, all want to follow Christ, but they're teaching different things. And in the end, it's like, where do you choose? Is there a truth? How do I know which one?
Right.
I mean, there's a great confusion there. And I think as a result, we've ended up with this modern heresy, which is, I don't need any church. It doesn't matter. All I need is Jesus. It doesn't matter what church you belong to.
Right.
And that's running rampant.
Right.
And now we're running into second and third generation people that's all they've ever been taught.
Right. As my mother said when I converted, she said, well, it makes him happy. You see, I mean, she saw that, God bless her, as a, just a subjective thing. It's a matter of opinion, and this is what Newman was fighting against. It's not the Trinity is not a matter of opinion. It's true.
Yeah. Interesting. It is
and because God is a person, that's what allows us to be persons. See, so that we're tied in with those dogmas. That's a dogma.
The dogma. Important dogma. Yeah. Let's turn to our first caller for this evening. Hello, what's your name and where are you calling from?
Yeah, my name is Augusta Harding and I'm calling from Indianapolis, Indiana.
Hello, what's your question for us today?
I've been listening to you and more than once, and I have really been interested in your answers because I can say that I'm first and foremost interested in truth.
Yeah.
I came out of a false religious system of Mormonism, and since then I've come to Christ, thank God, and rejoice in His grace.
Yes.
And my ears always perk up when I hear the only true church mentioned, because that's, of course, what we claimed to be in the Mormon Church.
Yeah.
But I've heard many things answered that I had problems with in Catholicism. But I have not heard, for instance, about Mary, and you're right, of course, she is the stumbling block for Protestants.
Yeah.
But my question would be, and I've never heard this answered, what do Catholics do in view of Deuteronomy 18, verses 9 through 14, where it is strictly forbidden not just to pray to, and I know you say you don't pray to the saints, you ask them, you speak to them, you have communication with them, asking them to pray for you. So how do you explain that we are not to be addressing the dead or seeking anything from them, and in Deuteronomy, and that is called abominable in God's sight? And also, if you would tell me also that Jesus said that there was a great gulf fixed between the living and the dead, and that nobody could possibly cross it
Thank you very much. Good questions.
All right. Well, Jesus himself says, when they say, he says, that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because they are living. That's in the Bible. That these people are living, so that the Bible itself is telling us that those souls, the patriarchs, have not died, so that they are there in which, in a capacity, we can appeal to them. There are passages in the book of the Maccabees, which is not in the Protestant Bible, where there are mentions of prayers to those who have gone before. So you shouldn't pray to dead things, but the point is that we're made in the image of God and we are living souls. That's the whole idea of the communion of saints. Just as the saints, like Mother Teresa, helped people in her life on this earth, she's still helping people in heaven. It doesn't stop because she's alive. She's a living soul. We're made in the image of God. We don't die.
Yeah, it's a bigger picture of the family.
Right.
And another thing is, with some verses like that and others, we always have, that's why we need a teacher who will help us interpret the meaning of scriptures, because the context is often very important. I mean, why were people, what they're warning against in Deuteronomy is what's called necromancy. I mean, praying to dead people that they would come alive as spirits and do evil things, or, it's Ouija board and those kind of, they didn't have Ouija boards back then, but that kind of an idea. We're dealing with the demonic. Of course we're not to do that, okay? And that's what that verse in that context is talking about. When Catholics pray to saints, we're praying to live people that are on the other side. As Jesus said, they're alive as we are, maybe more alive than we are. And we're not praying to them as if they're equal with God, but they're interceding for us to God, just as I can ask you to intercede for me.
Right. And in terms of the gulf, I think that Jesus meant that there's a gulf between those who are spiritually alive and those who are spiritually dead.
Yeah.
That's the gulf. It's the gulf between heaven and hell.
And we can't, on our own power, our own choice, we need grace to get over that gulf.
Right.
That's right. Let's go to this next email. It says, Dear Marcus, and it comes from Bill, in course of your work, have either of you found that anti-Catholic Protestants are somewhat ignorant of the history of the Reformation and the Reformation era? Do you think that if Catholics had a better knowledge of church history, they would be better equipped to respond to the spurious charges of anti-Catholics?
Yes.
Let's elaborate on that. I mean, it goes along with what you were saying earlier about they don't have a chance to read.
No, I think, I do want to say that I love Protestantism.
Yeah.
It is Christian, and I'm thankful for it. But I think that the Catholic Church has the fullness of Christianity. So I think that Catholics can learn more about Protestants too. I would put that both groups can learn from the Reformation. But you always hear about the Spanish Inquisition, the jailing of Galileo. There's this whole litany of Catholic atrocities, and of course you don't get into all the Catholics who were put to death, burned at the stake in England, and so on and so forth, and it was criminal to be a Catholic. What happened, I had never heard, as an English major, I had never, until I went to church with my son, where he lives in Portland, Oregon, to a church called John Fisher. I had never heard of John Fisher. Of course, he was of the 20 bishops of Henry VIII, he was the only one who was loyal to the Pope. And as such, of course, he had his head chopped off. And I never heard of that before.
It was my reading of authors like Hilaire Belloc that opened up my own mind and my own journey to the fact that I had pretty much been spoon-fed a revisionist understanding of the Reformation, of even church history, even American history. We get this idea in our growing up in many of our schools that early America was a very tolerant place. It's especially New England, when in fact it was not, especially tolerant to Catholics.
Right.
You could be.
It wasn't tolerant to Protestants.
That's
I mean, I live near the Hutchison River Parkway, and Hutchison had to flee to come there.
That's right. All right, let's try another email of yours. Hello, Marcus and Dr. Park. This is an excellent show. Thank you for your many insights. Regarding the communion of saints and the many challenges that come our way from Protestants on things like praying to and honoring Mary and the saints, do you recommend any good books or other resources to get answers from the Bible? Keep up the great work in Christ, Thaddeus. Any books that were helpful in your own journey with the scriptural quotes and such?
Well, I come back to Newman because in his various writings, in his sermons, he gives some of the best readings of biblical passages that I've ever encountered. I wish there were a book just on his part, but I was very much moved by Chesterton. I think he's a wonderful writer too, to help.
Yes.
Understand.
And Hardin's. Father Hardin's
Right,
Catechism.
exactly.
Of course, the New Catholic Catechism covers many scriptures and how they're understood. We're going to go to the next phone call, but I want to do this email really quickly. It's a very difficult question, but I think you ought to answer this right away. It says, "Hi, Grandpa. We are watching your show. It is good and funny. I like your speech. I love you. How are you doing? Love, William Jordan."
Great.
Let's go to our next phone call. Hello, what's your name and where are you calling from?
My name is Rosie, and I'm calling from Texas.
Hi, Rosie. What's your question for us?
Well, I'm fairly knowledgeable about our Blessed Mother, and I'm pretty decent in defense of her. But a Protestant friend of mine once threw at me Matthew 11:11, and I have to confess that I wasn't real eloquent on defense of Mary at that time.
Yes. In that particular verse in Matthew 11:11.
Better to be...
Pardon?
When he seems to rebuke his mother, is that?
That's when Jesus says there is no one greater than John the Baptist. And so the question is, well, if there's no one greater than John the Baptist, then what about Mary?
Okay.
Okay. Well, that's true. If he's being literal completely, well, Jesus is kind of left off,
Right.
too, in that argument.
Right.
I think there's an example of you see, that's why we need the church that Christ has given to us with the Holy Spirit as an interpreter of difficult passages.
Right.
The danger of pulling a text and now all of a sudden, how do we apply it? And there's so many texts that get us in trouble. One text that jumps out at me, another one, is where Jesus in the Old Testament says, where Isaiah says, "By his stripes we are healed." Well, there's so many today have run wild with that passage to kind of mean a health and wealth gospel.
Right.
If you're Christian, you shouldn't be sick.
Right.
Well, we need a teacher, and in this case, he's not referring to Mary as he doesn't in any of his talks about her holiness, though we do see Luke talking about that she's full of grace.
Right.
In the midst of that. So let's talk for a moment as we we've got another question. Good. I wasn't sure if we would have another caller this late in the game. Let's go. What's your name and where are you calling from?
I'm Jean, and I'm from snowy Cleveland, Ohio.
Oh, as the weather.com man says, the best place in the nation. Right now it's a little bit snowy there.
Yes, it is.
What's your question for us tonight?
I just wondered if Dr. Parks thought that, you know, how people are questioning the authorship of the four Gospels, if that had anything to do with the deconstructionalism that seems to be going on in literature. I'll hang up and listen.
Very good. Very good.
Well, deconstruction really began in Germany in the 19th century with biblical criticism. They call it the higher criticism. I call it the lower criticism because it's like taking a Greek temple and smashing it all into shards, and that's what you can do with the text because deconstruction is interesting because you need faith to read a text. So just as you need faith to believe that Charles Dickens existed and wrote Great Expectations, you need faith to read the Bible. A colleague of mine who converted to Christianity by studying the Bible studied with Ray Brown, who was a foremost biblical scholar. And he's an excellent writer in the sense that he can accommodate all the technical criticism, but still see the Bible as a whole and see it as a work of the Holy Spirit. And that the the analysis of this text was written here, this text was written there, he still sees how it all goes together.
Let's try our next email.
Right.
Dear Marcus and Dr. Park, this comes from Dom. Can you explain how the Catholic Church looks to Protestants and what some of the emotional and practical obstacles are between them and coming home to Rome? Often we Catholics forget how we appear to those outside the Church. And what can we do to be a better witness to non-Catholics?
Well, the main image, I think, of Catholicism to Protestants is tyranny. Protestants believe that the Pope is a tyrant. I mean, they no longer call him the Antichrist, but they see him as he is a great obstacle because they think that to be a Catholic you lose your freedom. There was a book when I was in college called American Freedom and Catholic Power, saying how Catholicism and democracy were incompatible. And I think that question, the question of choice, is very strong in Protestant minds. And of course, again, Newman, it did shock some very conservative Catholics because he once, at the time of Vatican I, which declared the Pope infallible, Newman raised a toast and he said, to the Pope and to conscience, because the two go together. And if you read the Pope's new encyclical, Faith and Reason, he talks about that. For instance, the Pope says, and I thought this was really wonderful, that there is no Catholic philosophy. There's Catholic theology, but not philosophy. All philosophies can contribute to an understanding of God. Now that's freedom. That is freedom.
Got a quick question here on the email that I think is good, because you did mention your article. The question is, how can I obtain a copy of your 50 greatest Catholic films?
Write to Crisis Magazine.
All right.
Right, yeah, I get it.
Maybe in closing, your journey has come through a lot of intellectual studies, and as you mentioned yourself, brought up in Presbyterianism and Sunday school and the whole 9 yards. And I'm wondering, maybe in closing, to talk a bit how becoming a Catholic has drawn you closer to Christ.
Well, I thank God every day for the Church. It's enabled. I mean, that's the goal, is to become closer to Christ. And again, Newman was the first one who really taught me about this, is the meaning of the sacraments. That the Church has given us sacraments so that we can grow closer. In other words, it's given us aids so that we can come closer to Christ. Again, Protestants think that the Catholic Church makes you feel guilty. It's just the opposite. The Catholic Church absolves you of guilt so you can get closer to Christ and do away with, get away with, to improve through the sacraments. What a blessing for us.
Father Park, what a great pleasure to have you on.
Father Park.
What did I, Father?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Park. It was being very wise there for me. Thank you for your spiritual direction. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to have you on the program, and I look forward to getting my own copy of 50 Greatest Catholic Films so I can make sure I have them in my video library so I can share them with my sons. Right. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you,
please stay with us. We'll be back in a moment for some closing thoughts for the journey home. In closing, I thought I'd first of all mention, as the question was asked earlier about how to obtain a copy of Dr. Park's article on the 50 greatest films from a Catholic perspective. And I think on the screen you can see an email address and also a phone number. For those of you that are on the radio, 1-800-651-1531. If you called that, you could get a copy of that, which is, it's great to have somebody help us weed through the availability of films out there, some which kind of sneak up on you when you think you've got a great one, and then lo and behold, there's something that you wish either you or your children hadn't seen or heard. Another number of things were brought up in in Dr. Park's conversion, as I thought about that and reflecting on letters that I've received from you, I thought, first of all, he stressed the importance of reading good Catholic literature. It is sad that so many people that have strong convictions about problems in the Catholic Church have never taken the time to truly read what the Church teaches. And he strongly emphasized the writings of Newman. There are others that we would strongly encourage you to do, and take the time particularly to read the Catechism of the Church, to hear what the Church teaches on the difficult dogmas of the Church. They're important for us to not only know, but so that we can live them out in our prayer lives and in our life reaching out to others. I also am impressed by his own struggle as an intellectual, as a teacher in an academic institution. And I know some of you who've written talk about how can I help my children who've gone off to college and seem to be abandoning their faith. And I'm reminded, as in Dr. Park's own journey, how his prayer to Mary opened up his own heart to being open to the Catholic Church. I'm reminded of that moment when Mary is wondering how this great thing can happen in her life with the Spirit coming on her and her becoming the mother of the Christ child. The angel's answer is, nothing is impossible with God. Never give up. Never give up on your children. In the midst of a secular institution, God can touch us. In the midst of someone who doesn't know the teaching of the Church, yet can even speak to us if we're open. We're also reminded from his journey, the work of Providence, which reminds us that the most important thing we can do for those in our life who do not know Christ or are not a part of the Church is to pray for them. Pray that God, through his grace, will touch their hearts, will open their minds, will bring into their lives the right book or a right person or an opportunity, maybe in the midst of crisis, that someone will be there to help them hear the truth. That's so important in our own lives. We should ask the Lord to help us always be aware of the many ways every day that he reaches out to touch us. Sometimes we're oblivious to the ways that he's helping us. But remember, there's not a thing that you and I go through in any day when God isn't right there with us. I want to thank you again for joining us each week on the Coming Home Network. Those on the Journey Home program, you see on the screen right now the address for the Coming Home Network if you'd like to find out more about our work helping Protestant clergy become Catholic. But I want to thank those of you who write, to send emails, for all of your prayers, especially for the EWTN network. We couldn't survive without not only the work of God, but the power of your prayers. Thank you. And I pray that God would bless you so that when we join again next time on the journey home, we can both share together on this blessed journey that Christ has brought us on. Thank you.